One night, I was driving home from work, following my usual route. It was close to midnight, probably around 12:15. My town is mostly quiet and unremarkable. Lots of woods, few houses, and not many people around. I was almost home, driving down a lonely road with a cornfield on one side and thick woods on the other. It was midsummer, about 75 degrees, so I had the top down on my convertible. Cruising along at about 50 miles per hour, I was lost in thought when a sudden, gut-wrenching scream shattered the silence. It sounded like a woman, and it was close, but I couldn't pinpoint if it came from the cornfield or the woods. I slammed on the brakes, pulling over and strained to listen. Another cry came, clearly from the woods on my left. A woman's voice, desperate and pleading. I grabbed the baton I keep in my back seat, got out of the car, and called out, "Is someone out there?" The voice answered, "Please help me." I didn't think twice. I hurried into the woods, pushing aside branches as I followed her voice. "Keep calling out so I can find you," I shouted. She cried out for help every few seconds, and each time I ran in the direction of the sound. But after a while, I noticed something unsettling. No matter how deep I went, her cries never sounded closer, as if they were always just out of reach. I was moving fast, yet the distance between us didn't change. "Where are you?" I shouted again, stopping in my tracks. After a pause, her voice came back. "Help!" But by now, I was getting a strange feeling. Something about this wasn't right. I had the sudden, unnerving suspicion that I was being led somewhere. I turned and ran back toward my car, fighting through branches, ignoring the voice still calling out to me, still the same distance away. I didn't stop until I saw the glow of my headlights through the trees. Once I reached my car, I jumped in, started the engine, and sped off. I called 911 and reported what I'd heard, in case someone really was in trouble. But I wasn't about to go back. The whole experience left me shaken, and after telling a few close friends and family, I tried to put it behind me. A week later, though, I saw something on the news that sent a chill through me. The body of a woman, in her 30s, had been found by a hiker with his dog. No obvious signs of foul play, the report said. The location? Roughly the same area in the woods where I'd heard those screams. It's a big stretch of forest, sure, but the coincidence still leaves me feeling uneasy. I was driving from Brooklyn to Vermont to spend the weekend snowboarding at my friend John's cabin. At the time, I owned two cars, a 2013 BMW 3 Series and a 2006 Ford F-150. For this trip, I'd chosen the F-150, loaded with my snowboarding gear in the truck bed. By this point, I was about 45 minutes from John's cabin. It was late, around 10 p.m., and the roads were pitch dark and covered in snow. Not another car was in sight. A few weeks back, I'd just gotten the truck back from the mechanic. It was a frequent troublemaker, and that night was no different. Right in the middle of this silent, dark stretch, my engine started overheating, redlining on the gauge. I slowed to a stop on the shoulder to let it cool down. After a few minutes, I tried driving again, but even at low speeds, the needle shot back up. I had no choice but to pull over and turn the truck off. I tried to diagnose the problem, but in the dark and snow, it was impossible. I reached for my phone to call John, only to realize there was zero reception. No way to get help. I got back into the truck, turned it on, and let it idle for warmth, since it only seemed to overheat when I drove. After waiting for about 10 minutes, I saw headlights approaching. I flicked my hazards on, opened the door, and waved my arms. The driver of a small Toyota pulled over, rolled down his window, and I thanked him for stopping, asking if I could use his phone. "What happened?" he asked. I explained that my truck was overheating and was undrivable. He then asked, "Are you alone?" I hesitated for a second and then replied, "Yeah." He handed me his cell phone, and I called John, who advised me to contact a local towing company and said he'd come pick me up. After that, I called the tow company and requested assistance. The whole time, the man in the Toyota watched me without a word. When I handed him back his phone, he just nodded, rolled up his window, and drove off, his taillights fading into the dark. I was alone again. I climbed back into my truck, keeping it idling for warmth. Out of curiosity, I flicked off the headlights, and when I say it was pitch black, I mean I couldn't see an inch outside my windows. I passed the time playing games on my phone, waiting. After about 20 minutes, a sudden loud bang hit my passenger side window. My heart skipped a beat as I looked over, barely able to see the figure in the dark. A man's voice started pleading for help, shouting that he was freezing. He was trying the door handle, but it was locked. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it on the window, revealing a figure in a large black coat, hood pulled over his head. "What's wrong?" I called out, suspicious. He said he was lost and stranded, begging to get out of the cold. Something felt off, and I hesitated, trying to think of a way to confirm his intentions. But before I could speak, he began yanking the door handle and pounding on the window with increasing aggression, shouting louder. My gut instinct took over. I threw the truck in drive. He must have realized this because he started hitting the window even harder, as if trying to break it. I sped off, pushing the truck up to 30 miles per hour despite the overheating engine. Then, as I crested a hill, I saw something that made my heart race. Up ahead, I saw taillights on the roadside, the same Toyota from earlier. I slowed down, lowering my window slightly to peer out, but the car looked empty. In the light of my own taillights, I saw fresh footprints in the snow leading from the Toyota. That man, the one who had banged on my window, had been the driver all along. He'd circled back and tried to lure me into opening my door. I pushed my truck down the road, not caring about the damage to the engine. A few minutes later, headlights approached from the opposite direction. It was the tow truck. Relieved, I flashed my lights, and he pulled over. I quickly told him what had happened, and he joked that he'd arrived just in time. He asked if the guy had any weapons, but I couldn't say. "Well, let's not stick around to find out," he replied. It took about 15 minutes to hook up my truck, and the Toyota never drove by. The guy must have turned around to avoid us. Once the tow truck driver had my truck secured, I used his phone to call John, who met us at the body shop. Despite the rough night, John and I still went snowboarding that weekend. The mechanics later found that a broken water pump had caused the overheating, and I sold that truck a few weeks later. I'll always be grateful I didn't unlock that door or lower my window to that man. If I had, who knows what could have happened to me in that desolate spot. I was 17 when I had my first girlfriend. I was living with my mom at the time since my parents had divorced when I was 11. One Friday, I asked my girlfriend if she'd like to go on a date, and she agreed. Both of us were working part-time jobs, me at a grocery store and her at Starbucks, alongside finishing our senior year of high school. With minimal homework that weekend, it seemed like the perfect night to go out. After work, I picked her up from her place, and we went to a small restaurant about 10 minutes from my house, which was all I could afford back then. We had a nice dinner, but as the evening went on, it grew dark. When I dropped her back at her house, she commented that the night felt too short. I admitted that I couldn't afford anything more extravagant, so we agreed to take a night drive to extend the date. We drove around town for a bit and eventually found ourselves on a deserted road surrounded by woods. Soon enough, the paved road ended, and we were traveling on a dirt path. I suddenly felt the urge to pee and mentioned it to her. Coincidentally, she needed to go as well. So we pulled over and stepped out of the car. Almost immediately, a horrible, indescribable smell hit us. I brushed it off, thinking maybe someone else had stopped nearby to do the same thing. My girlfriend even gagged from the stench, but I assured her we'd be quick and then get back in the car. We walked over to a flat area nearby to relieve ourselves. As we headed back toward the car, we heard a distinct noise, a twig snapping to our left. Worried it might be an animal, I urged us to hurry back to the car. But just as I reached for the door, a blood-chilling scream echoed from the exact spot we'd just been. It sounded like someone was terrified or in pain. I told my girlfriend to get in the car and lock the doors while I went to check it out. She begged me not to go, but I figured investigating would put her at ease. I took a few steps toward where we'd been, flashlight in hand. Then, I heard the scream again. This time, much closer. My bravery faded instantly as I realized how close it was. Instead of going further, I pulled out my phone, turned on the flash, and snapped a quick picture in the direction of the noise. As the flash lit up the scene, I saw him, a man standing there, dressed in a white shirt with black stripes, next to a blue tarp on the ground. He was just standing there, completely still. Fear surged through me, and I dashed back to the car. I unlocked the door, jumped in, and floored it. My girlfriend, seeing the panic on my face, kept asking what happened, but I told her I'd explain once we were safe. We sped through the dark roads, heading back into town, then finally to her house. Once we were inside her room, I told her what I'd seen. A man, standing with a blue tarp in front of him, just staring at me in the dark. I showed her the picture, and she was just as horrified as I was. She asked me to stay the night, which I agreed to since we were both too freaked out to be alone, and we had no school or work the next day anyway. That night was, without a doubt, the scariest experience of my life. Today, we're no longer together. I'm 23 now and she's 22, but we're still best friends and sometimes even reminisce about that eerie night that neither of us will ever forget. It was late summer in 2011, and I was 18, nearly 19, spending the evening with my best friend, who was a few years younger. We lived in a rural area of southwestern Virginia, close to Mount Airy, North Carolina. Around here, most places shut down by 10 p.m., so we often had to get creative to entertain ourselves. Luckily, we were pretty good at that. The night started off with a trip to the mall, then driving around town, trying, unsuccessfully, to meet girls. Typical teenage stuff. When that didn't pan out, we ended up going bowling until the lanes closed. Afterward, we headed to Main Street around midnight, strolling through some back alleys, feeling like the edgy teens we thought we were. There was never much worry about danger, given the low crime rates around here. Once we'd wandered through all the streets, we started getting bored again and decided to grab a late-night bite at Waffle House, pretty much the only option available. After eating, we made a quick stop at Walmart, but still weren't ready to call it a night. So, we hopped in the car and set off down some of the backcountry roads. Late-night drives were our thing, especially since we had to make our own fun. The road we were on was somewhat unfamiliar. I'd only driven it once during the day. It wasn't far from where either of us lived, but we just never had a reason to go down it. Starting out in North Carolina, the road was paved, but within a mile, it crossed into Virginia and turned to dirt, like many roads around here. The county barely maintained it due to its isolation and how it often washed out in heavy rains. As we drove slowly down the bumpy road, we were cautious, both due to the road conditions and because we didn't know the area well. It was a desolate stretch, bordered by thick woods, and it lay at the base of a small mountain. At night, it was easy to miss any houses along the way, but we did catch a glimpse of one, mainly because we saw a light on. Under the glow of a porch, light stood a man, motionless except for his head, which turned to follow our car as we drove by. We couldn't make out his features, but something about his presence was unsettling. We tried to laugh it off, thinking he was just stepping outside for a smoke, but his intense, unblinking stare stuck with us. Leaving that man behind, we picked up our speed, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Within a few minutes, we reached the end of the dirt road and turned onto a paved road I knew better. This stretch ran along a mountain ridge, offering views of the town below, and we started to feel more at ease, enjoying the sights as we drove. A few miles later, we turned again to make our way back toward my house. This road was even more familiar to me, bordered by woods, and I'd driven it countless times. As we neared the main highway, something caught our headlights up ahead. Initially, we thought it might be a deer, as they're everywhere around here, so we slowed down. But as we got closer, we noticed it was much larger and white, so we figured it might be an albino deer. However, as we approached, it became clear it wasn't an animal at all. It was a person, a woman, hunched over, walking in the left lane as if following traffic rules. My friend, equally confused, asked, "What's someone doing walking out here at this hour?" We both peered closer, and I saw her clearly for the first time. An older woman with long, scraggly gray hair, wearing a white t-shirt and white pants. She kept her back to us as we drew closer, but suddenly, about 50 feet away, she turned around. Her face was haunting, deep eye sockets with dark circles, greasy hair, and skin that looked prematurely aged. It gave the impression of someone on drugs, though I couldn't be sure. She could have been anywhere from her mid-40s to late 50s, but that wasn't the scariest part. She raised her hands, waving them frantically, and started running toward us. In one hand, she held what looked like a large knife, and her clothes appeared stained with dried blood. Any desire we had to act tough vanished. I floored it, speeding past her without a second glance. The fear lingered long after we'd left her behind, and what should have been a quick 5-minute drive back to my place turned into a 35-minute detour, just from the irrational fear she might somehow follow us. In a community as small as ours, you know almost everyone, but neither of us had ever seen her before, and we never saw her again. We kept checking the news, expecting to hear something about a bloody woman found wandering the roads, but there was nothing. To this day, I have no idea why she was out there, covered in blood, in the early hours of the morning with a knife in her hand. Now, I live with my wife on that mountain ridge road between the two roads where those strange encounters happened. I drive that road nearly every day and haven't seen any sign of that woman since. But earlier this year, a large drug and cockfighting ring was busted near the road where the staring man's house was. I can't be sure if it was the same house or if those people were even there back then, but I often wonder if he was somehow involved. As for the woman on the road, I just hope I never encounter her again.